You're standing in a cave in what will eventually be called Croatia. It is roughly 40,000 years ago. The fire in front of you is small but enough. Your children are asleep behind you. Outside, the wind is doing something the wind has been doing for weeks, driving sleet horizontally across a landscape that has not seen a warm day in longer than anyone in your group can remember. You are Homo sapiens. You have been in Europe for perhaps a few thousand years, and somewhere in the valley below, in a different cave around a different fire, a family of Neanderthals is doing almost exactly what you are doing right now. They have been here for 300,000 years. You have been here for maybe 5,000. They are stronger than you. Their bones are denser. Their bodies are better adapted to this cold than yours will ever be. They have survived ice ages that would have ended your lineage before it started. They know this landscape the way you know your own name. And within 10,000 years of your arrival, every single one of them will be gone. Not some of them. All of them. An entire human species, intelligent, tool-using, fire-making, burying their dead with flowers, erased so completely that for most of recorded history, no one even knew they had existed. So here's the question that should sit with you uncomfortably. What did we do, or more precisely, what did we have that they did not? Because the answer is not what the standard story tells you. And once you understand what actually separated us from every other human species that ever walked this planet, you will never feel quite the same about the word civilization again. Let's start with what actually existed before we showed up, because this part almost never gets the attention it deserves. At roughly 300,000 years ago, Earth was not a planet with one human species. It had at least 5. Homo sapiens in Africa, Neanderthals across Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans across Eastern Asia and into the Pacific, Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, Homo floresiensis, a species so small researchers initially refused to believe it was human, on the Indonesian island of Flores. 5 distinct human lineages, each with its own evolutionary history spanning hundreds of thousands of years, each adapted to its specific environment with a precision that took geological time to produce. By 10,000 years ago, only one remained. In 2010, Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published the first complete sequencing of the Neanderthal genome, one of the most significant scientific achievements of the 21st century. The finding was immediate and irreversible. Modern humans of non-African descent carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Every person reading this who has European or Asian ancestry is carrying a small inheritance from a species we watched disappear. We did not simply replace Neanderthals. We absorbed them. Some of them became us. Think about that. The boundary between species that we draw so cleanly in textbooks was considerably blurrier in reality. These were not alien creatures we observed from a distance. Some of them were family. Honestly, the taxonomy of human extinction is considerably more complicated than anyone taught you in school. Here is something that should make you genuinely reconsider every caveman image you have ever seen. Neanderthals were not primitive. That framing is not just inaccurate. It is the specific kind of inaccuracy that tells you more about the people doing the describing than about the thing being described. Neanderthals controlled fire. They made and used complex hafted tools, stone points attached to wooden shafts with birch tar adhesive they manufactured through a multi-step process requiring sustained heat management. In 2020, Marie Seresi at Leiden University published analysis confirming Neanderthals were producing a specific type of specialized bone tool, lyswars, used for working hides into leather, that predates the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe. They invented this technology independently. We may have learned it from them. They buried their dead. At Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, archaeologist Ralph Selecki documented a Neanderthal burial from roughly 60,000 years ago surrounded by flower pollen, suggesting ritual placement, though this remains debated. What is not debated is that Neanderthals regularly buried their dead in specific positions, sometimes with objects, consistently enough across multiple sites and tens of thousands of years to indicate it was intentional behavior rather than accident. They cared for their injured. The Shanidar skeleton, known as Shanidar I, was an adult male who had survived a crushing blow to the left side of his skull that left him blind in one eye, had a withered and useless right arm that had been amputated at the elbow, and walked with a severe limp from healed leg injuries. He lived to approximately 40 years old, ancient by Neanderthal standards, which means his group fed him, protected him, and kept him alive for years after he could no longer contribute to hunting or defense. That is not the behavior of a primitive creature. That is compassion, structured, sustained, resource-costly compassion for a member of the group who could not reciprocate it. Did you know? In 2023, a study led by João Zilhau at the University of Barcelona confirmed that a Neanderthal child buried at a site in Spain roughly 50,000 years ago showed evidence of deliberate grave preparation, including the removal of the child's body from the location of death and its its careful placement in a specifically chosen spot. This was not accidental burial. It was a funeral, performed by a species we spent most of the 20th century describing as too primitive for symbolic thought. Now, here's the part that changes everything. If Neanderthals were intelligent, tool-using, fire-controlling, hide-working, dead-burying, injured-caring creatures, why did they disappear within 10,000 years of contact with Homo sapiens? The standard answer used to be violence. We killed them. But the genetic evidence from Pebo's work makes this impossible as a complete explanation. You cannot interbreed with something you are systematically exterminating. Some degree of integration happened. The extinction was not purely a war. The next answer was disease. We brought pathogens from Africa, to which Neanderthals had no immunity. This is plausible and probably contributed, but it does not explain the complete and total disappearance of every Neanderthal population across an enormous geographic range over a period of thousands of years. The answer that the current evidence most strongly supports is more specific and considerably more uncomfortable. In 2023, a research team led by Simon Neubauer at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published analysis comparing the brain development patterns of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals using endocast data, internal skull impressions that preserve the shape of the brain. The finding was precise. Neanderthal brains and Homo sapiens brains were similar in overall volume. They were different in shape. Specifically, the human cerebellum, the region at the back of the brain associated with language processing, cognitive flexibility, and social learning, was proportionally larger and more rounded in Homo sapiens than in Neanderthals. This difference in brain architecture, Neubauer's team argued, may have produced a difference in cognitive capacity that was invisible in any single interaction, but decisive over thousands of years of competition. Not raw intelligence, not tool-making ability, something more specific, the capacity to teach strangers. Let's talk about this directly. Neanderthals learned. They accumulated knowledge within their groups across generations, but the evidence suggests their social learning was primarily vertical, parent to child, elder to younger member of the same group. Knowledge moved downward through family lines. Homo sapiens did something different. We learned horizontally. We shared knowledge across groups, between unrelated individuals, between different bands, between people who had no biological obligation to help each other at all. We built what researchers now call cumulative culture, a ratchet system where each generation does not just inherit knowledge from its parents, but adds to a collective pool maintained across an entire social network that extends far beyond any single family group. In 2012, Kim Steroni at the Australian National University published a book-length argument for exactly this mechanism as the decisive factor in human cognitive dominance. Not a bigger brain, not a specific language gene, but a social architecture that allowed information to compound across populations in a way that Neanderthal social structure did not support at the same scale. The evidence for this is visible in the stone tools. Neanderthal tool technologies, the Mousterian industry, remained largely stable for roughly 200,000 years. The same basic designs, the same basic techniques, across an enormous span of time. When change occurred, it occurred slowly and locally. Homo sapiens tool technologies, by contrast, show rapid regional variation, long-distance exchange of raw materials, and accelerating innovation. Not because Homo sapiens were smarter in any single moment, because our innovations did not stay local. They spread. Think about that. A Neanderthal could invent something genuinely useful, and that invention would die with their group if the group died. A Homo sapiens invented something, and it propagated across hundreds of kilometers through exchange networks that connected groups who had never met. One system accumulated knowledge locally, the other accumulated it globally. Over thousands of years, the compounding difference became insurmountable. Homo sapiens sites in Europe, dating to roughly 40,000 to 30,000 years ago, contain raw materials sourced from locations up to 800 kilometers away. Evidence of exchange networks connecting multiple distinct groups across enormous distances. Neanderthal sites from the same period rarely show raw material transport beyond 80 kilometers. That tenfold difference in network reach is not a minor variation. It is a fundamentally different relationship with social space. Here is something that should make you feel a little uncomfortable. We tend to tell the story of Neanderthal extinction as a mystery, as if we genuinely do not know what happened, as if the evidence is too thin to draw conclusions. This framing is not accurate. The evidence points clearly toward a species that was cognitively capable, emotionally complex, and genuinely human in most of the ways that matter, and that was outcompeted not because it was inferior in any absolute sense, but because it was operating with a social architecture that could not match the scale of our information network. We did not defeat a lesser species. We out-networked a different kind of mind. The uncomfortable implication of that is obvious and almost never stated directly. The Neanderthals who died in European caves 40,000 years ago were not less conscious, less feeling, or less aware of their extinction than we would be of ours. They simply simply had fewer people to call. But here is the twist. The cognitive architecture that allowed us to outcompete every other human species is the same architecture that produced everything we now call civilization. Language that transmits across groups, social networks that compound knowledge faster than any single mind can generate it, the capacity to cooperate with strangers at scale, to build institutions, cities, supply chains, and scientific communities that pool the cognitive output of millions of people who will never meet each other. Everything you have, every piece of technology, every medical advance, every piece of accumulated human knowledge exists because our ancestors could learn from people they had never met, in places they had never been, about problems they had never personally encountered. The Neanderthals had fire, they had tools, they had grief and care and whatever they felt standing over the small grave in Spain 50,000 years ago. What they did not have was us, not in the sense of our biology, but in the sense of our social reach. The network that ultimately absorbed and replaced them was the same network that eventually produced the capacity to find their bones, sequence their DNA, and understand, with something that feels uncomfortably close to guilt, exactly what we were to each other. Right now, in a laboratory at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, Svante Pääbo's team, he won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022, specifically for the Neanderthal genome work, is continuing to extract and analyze ancient DNA from specimens across multiple sites. Every new sample adds resolution to a picture of a world we destroyed so thoroughly that we forgot it had existed. The people doing that work carry Neanderthal DNA themselves. Part of what they are piecing together is a record of their own ancestors. Part of what they keep finding is evidence of a species that was more like us than we were prepared to admit. They simply never got to build a network large enough to save them. If this completely changed how you think about what it means to be human, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because next time we are asking how ancient humans survived snake bites with no antivenom, no hospitals, and no understanding of what venom actually does to the body, and why some of what they did actually worked. The answer is darker and more clinically precise than anything modern medicine would like to credit. See you in the next one.